Okay, so today's topic, we're just going to jump right in. Welcome to Therapy and Theology with Dr. Joel Muddamalle and Jim Kress. I'm Lysa TerKeurst, and the topic today is pornography. And we're calling this show the Porn Demic. Now, as we get into this topic, I just want to acknowledge what we've had to acknowledge in our study days on this, and that is that pornography is tough. And people are going to enter into this conversation with several different reactions or preconceived notions as you hear the word pornography. So I'm going to share where I'm at in this. And that is when I hear the word pornography, I get an instant feeling inside of me, two things. One, I don't get it. And two, it is attached to hurt. Now, I want to be incredibly sensitive because I know there are many people who absolutely do get it. And so let me read a couple of the reactions that we recorded when we were studying this. Maybe your reaction is, I've been so deeply hurt by this, just the word pornography makes me cringe or cry, and I get that. Or, I struggle with pornography myself. Maybe some people are saying that. Or I have a lot of questions around this topic. Or I've been wanting to have conversations around this topic, but have never known how to have the conversations, or have never felt comfortable enough to have conversations like, who do you talk to about this with, So I recognize that all different people are having several different reactions to hearing the word pornography. I want to acknowledge that, and I want to say right off the bat, no matter where you come from, we're not going to shame you. We're not going to shame you if you don't get it. We're not going to shame you if hearing the word makes you cringe or cry, just the word pornography.
That's right.
We're not going to shame you for any of these reactions, and we're especially not going to shame you if you yourself are struggling with pornography, and that can be both men and women. Men struggle with pornography, and the statistics are showing that it's on the rise for women to struggle with pornography. So we want to go there. I think there are 5 main questions that I want to tackle today. And the first question is, what's really going on here? What's really going on here with pornography? I know, Jim, in our conversations about it, you've really helped me depersonalize this. In other words, as a woman, you've helped me see that there's some neurochemistry going on inside of the brain of the person who is struggling with pornography, which when you educated me on this, it really helped me to see that, if I love someone and they're struggling with pornography, that it's not so much an issue that I should personalize, but rather I just need to be informed by it. So help us understand what's really going on here with pornography.
Well, thank you, Lysa. The stats to me, if we move into statistics for a moment, they're important until they're kind of not important anymore. I always say from the Apollo program with NASA Houston, we have a problem. And so with that, what's going on, especially during that pandemic, you remember the COVID pandemic? Remember that, y'all? Is the stats through Pornhub and other things were just astronomically high. Well, yeah, we're sitting around. Boredom's the number one trigger I see with men in porn is think about the brain just being beep, just nothing going on, and then boom, I hit a spike by thinking about going to porn and then actually going and looking as it hits that nucleus accumbens, the pleasure center in the brain. So it really makes sense that it's about medicating and numbing out and escaping reality. And probably from Barna research and from some others, our friends at Covenant Eyes, is, for sure at least about 50% of evangelical men, and that stat does not discriminate against pastors. It includes pastors. Really probably 68 to maybe 74%, and men will underreport. And that means men who just casually might use it or watch through social media or something else. They're looking at what I call sexually stimulating material. It may not be dubbed as porn. So the stats are very soberingly high. And as you've alluded to, the stats for women are rising higher more and more these days. So we've got a real problem with this. And of course, on the other side of that problem is, where are we addressing this and providing, as I say, we have more help and hope than you have problems, but where are we addressing it?
Talking about addressing it, and I guess where we've had some interesting conversations.
Boy, haven't we, off mic? We should have recorded those.
And, it is, it's a strange dynamic because I'm a woman who I say, like, I don't get this. Like, there's no relational connection there. For me, I'm like, on the one level, I can logically understand what porn is doing, and neurochemically, I can get there. Mm-hmm. But relationally, I don't get it. So before we move on, like what's really going on here, I just want two dudes to comment about this.
Yeah, we were talking about this earlier, and I can say this is kind of my thought behind pornography is it's a place to exercise control. There's an underlying sense that anytime there's instability in our lives, the first thing that we want to do is grasp for some means of control, to gain power over it, authority over it, to make sense of this. And so we're going to get into some of the theological conversation as well, but the basic impulse of sexuality biblically is a good thing, and we'll talk about that. But what's happened with pornography, I think for a lot of men, and then as we mentioned, the stats are incredibly rising for women as well, it's the presence of instability and the lack of control and going to an illegitimate source that promises us an imaginative source of control and power and the ability to kind of make my own story. And on
demand, right?
And on demand, when I want it, how I want it, in the frequency that I want it, and at the end of it, we get the cocaine shot for an example. I know that you actually have a very legitimate, Jim, connection between what's happening biochemically in our bodies and the impact of even like drugs like cocaine. True. We get that hit. And it reinforces that, hey, I just was able to control something and it felt really good, which then sets in place a pattern of behavior that actually imprisons us.
So is it like, okay, we recognize that women also can struggle with pornography. So, but because I'm a female and I'm talking to a guy, I'm just going to ask as if it's, a guy's problem. Okay. But we recognize it goes both ways.
Yeah,
sure.
All right. Is it a connection? Like, because that's the part that I don't get. I hear everything you're saying, and I really liked what you said about that it's a way to be in control of the experience. So, and I get that. It's on demand, all of that.
Yeah.
Jim, I think you have it's airbrushed,
Yeah, and these A's came out with a guy named Dr. Cooper a long time ago, and I've added more to them. And the reason it's so important now is because of the porndemic and all that's gone on in the global pandemic, that it is now more palatable than ever or more powerful than ever of these A's. I've added 2 more to them. So pornography is accessible. You can get to it easily. It's in your pocket. There's the phone. It's anonymous, so you think, but often it is. I can be whoever I want to be with whoever I want to be. It's accessible, it's anonymous, it's affordable. Most people don't pay for porn these days. It's just out there all over the place. It's also airbrushed, and that's an old pornography term that what you're looking at, that person's not even real. It's almost like its own avatar, but you can find anybody, however they do that on screens.
Well, they are real, but they're playing a part.
They're playing a part, but they can make that person up look so much and make it filter in 4K. People do that on Instagram all the time, right? It's like it's the ultimate filter. And then it's accelerated. That we're seeing people with hardly any, fellas especially, hardly any big trauma story back. That's what we always look for before. Now they come in, that's that. You can do 2 lines of cocaine and not be addicted, but smoke 1 crack pipe. That's that accelerated piece. And guys go, man, I am accelerated and got hooked so fast. And then the pastor who said to me, at one point he said, Jim, I woke up and I was outside the teenage girl in my church's house about to peer in a window and woke up. And he said, I was just back looking at porn thinking it would never progress to that. We talked about that the other day, Joe. It is so progressive and degenerative. People say, I never thought I'd go this far. Accelerated. You're not naive around it. And even this morning, what did we do? 2 hours in there in the other room, which
easy.
was wonderful conversation. And here's the deal. All I took away from that was you're not going to able, in your brilliant brain that you have, be able to rationalize, which is a term in addiction, and say, this makes sense to me. I would, for anyone else listening, don't try to understand it because you're probably not going to, but you can accept it, which is why we often talk about a pornography addiction and go, boy, I don't understand it in me, but I can understand there's something going on there. Is it really a connection? Change connection for a moment to attachment. And once I attach and my body, nobody's thinking it in their prefrontal cortex, command central of the brain. They're thinking and feeling in their body that I feel there's an attachment that's going on. And it's a place, I say for men I work with, it does not require me to show up as a man. I have to show up or get to show up as some developmentally between ages 4 to 14, like a kid in a candy store, and I rule my own kingdom. Thus, pornography addiction is a disorder of worship. Is that too deep, too far?
No, I think that's really helpful. And you're right. I'm not naive. Like, I know what you're talking about. And it's not just me. I get so many comments and messages that come my direction of women that are in a marriage or they have a boyfriend. And this is like the elephant in the room. And it does something to a woman when her husband is also dabbling in or maybe addicted to porn. And I think you're right. I keep trying to rationalize this. I keep trying to make sense of it. And I think what it is, I just need to get the facts around it and just say, it is what it is.
There you go.
Okay. So what does it do neurochemically? That's my second question, to a man. What is this that's happening?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's very important. Because if you're a cocaine addict, if you're an alcoholic, if you're a gambling addict, to go out, you have to go out and find things. Where's the drug dealer? Maybe down in the street in a very bad part of town. For someone who's a pornography struggler or a pornography addict, where's the drug dealer live? Inside his body. So you have these neurotransmitters. You'll hear it once. You don't have to go Google this, folks. Dopamine, take the word amine off, dope. I'm a dope addict. So every porn addict is a drug addict. Here's what goes on with neurochemistry.
That's a strong statement.
It's because it's empirically proven in the research. If you look at it, dopamine fires, serotonin, that feel-good chemical, right? Catecholamines, you don't need to know what that is, but that's a very powerful neurotransmitter. You also have adrenaline and norepinephrine firing like crazy. And PEA is that sexual tension. Wow is rising. Any human that's been sexual knows that. And then you have this big missing thing, like here on my thumb. You don't have oxytocin, because oxytocin bonds you with the other person, divinely made by the Trinity. And when someone's acting out to porn by him or herself, they can't bond with themselves. So there's an abyss that is just there. Those neurochemicals rise up as a person's acting out, whether it's sexual with a person or in porn, and then they plummet when the person's done with the sexual act, and they're left with just despair. So all those major drugs are going on. That's why we say it absolutely meets criteria for drug addiction.
So what you just described sounds like a cocktail, like an alcoholic
very
cocktail.
Much. Powerful one.
And a very powerful one. So I don't think this has ever happened on the set of Therapy and Theology, right? But you said something, and I'm just going to say it. I want to dig into this. You said it's not possible to bond with yourself. Right?
Well, I know where you're
he knows
going,
where I'm going with this.
But what kind of a bond is that?
Okay, this is where I want to get to theologically, because what you just described biochemically, this is where I think it's so important for us to see that the theological premises of who we are as human beings are affirmed often, almost exclusively every time, biochemically by what you just described. So let me read to us Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 through 25, because what you described biochemically is actually an affirmation of a theological statement that God makes to Adam and Eve prior to the fall. This is what the text says. This is why a man leaves his father and mother and, what's this word? Bonds with his wife, right? The connection of that Hebrew word bonds is sexual, absolutely. And here's why we know this. And they become one flesh. Well, how do a man and woman become one flesh? This is a nod to sexual intimacy. And then verse 25, both the man and his wife were naked and yet felt no shame, right? So the very first presence of sexuality in the biblical text is a posture and position of purity and of sexual bliss and intimacy within the confines of something that is safe. What you just described,
And
Jim,
in the confines of there's no shame.
and there's no shame.
And I often say I love that verse so much because it gives me this feeling that Adam and Eve were able to stand there, not just physically vulnerable, but vulnerable in every way. They were naked, physically, emotionally, spiritually. You know, they were able to stand that vulnerable before God and with each other because they had no other opinions to contend with but the absolute love of God himself and a pure acceptance of one another.
That's so good,
Love
Lysa.
it.
And I go back to Jim to your question: what kind of bond is this when we break the God-ordained bond that is supposed to take place? And here's what it is: it's a selfish bond. The theologian Martin Luther describes actually what's taking place in Genesis 3, and he makes this observation. He says that the human heart is a love pump, and that pump is pouring out love onto the object of affection, which is God himself. Now, at the fall, the pump doesn't cease to pump. What happens is it gets knocked off kilter. And when it gets knocked off kilter, this is the Latin phrase he uses, homo incurvatus in se, he says humanity becomes curved in upon themselves, right?
Wow, what a
So
picture.
what's happening in pornography? What's happening? What is the biochemical evidence? What is the theological evidence? What is taking place? I think it's, and you mentioned this before, Jim, disordered worship.
Yeah.
We're becoming curved in on ourselves, and instead of God being the object of our worship, we actually act out illegitimate worship by serving and worshiping ourselves through illegitimate means, which is pornography.
So is it worshiping ourselves or is it worshiping pleasure that we want?
Great question.
Yeah, that's a great.
I
what
vote
do you
for
think?
pleasure, but I think by default, I will turn. C.S. Lewis has a great quote. It's too long to bring in here about, he wrote in a letter, it's not in one of his books, I've used it in my teaching for years, where he says when a guy he talked about lust, so it fits, it turns him back into what he calls the prison of himself,
Right.
where these shadowy brides are there and no woman can ever compare to the fantasy images, and it puts him in a prison he's hardly ever going to get out of. So I think it is about passion, quote, or lust, or it's worshiping this or worshiping an idea. But in the end, Lewis said in this quote that all those women adore him. This is exact wording. They adore this man and he feels adored. So whether he thinks it, he will feel worship. And think about worship as worthship. I am finally worthy of what, and that's both anecdotally and I think with research proven time and time again.
But
both.
but the women are not really adoring him.
See, this is back to your logical, rational brain.
I'm
no,
just
it's
like,
okay.
I know. So for the guy, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It does not matter.
Let's just
in
be honest.
imagination.
It's imagination, and it's back to control. This is like relationships that are healthy. We care about what other people think. Like my actions have consequences on other people. In this situation, there ain't none of that.
Well, think about
There is that, but but
It's only about me.
Okay.
Yeah, it's again for you to rationalize it. Think about, he talks about it. I don't do this. I love football. We're in that season, right? What does he do? What type of football is he kind of very engaged in? Starts with F.
Fantasy football.
Fantasy football.
Which I had a great pickup today on the waiver
he's
wires.
getting neurochemically excited, but it really ties into this. I'm not calling it porn. Don't worry. But people are like, my sons. I'm like, can we just watch the game? No, but the stats in this player, I'm like, but that player's on 10 different teams. Is that right?
Oh, it's worse
And
for
I'm
me.
like,
I watch
just-
Red Zone. All the games happening all at the same time.
Don't get me off of Red Zone.
It's bad.
But listen, even Red Zone, like neurochemically.
Exactly.
So that's an area that a lot of people, men are throwing with their fantasy football, but that's not real. You don't know Tom Brady.
Right.
You can't pick him on
But
a team.
I'm very
but it feels
emotionally
real to them.
invested in how well they play.
Very much. It's a
But
great
it is
metaphor.
a fantasy.
It's a
Yeah,
fantasy.
it's called fantasy
That's why it's
football.
called fantasy football.
Okay, so let's park so that's what's happening with
Yeah.
men. Now, what is this doing to women? Because that's the third question that I want us to put on the table. So when, and again, it could be that the woman is addicted or
That's right.
watching porn and it's going to bother her husband. It can go both ways. I want to, again, say that.
May I tell you this real quick? Joel will
Yes.
back me, I guarantee, and I'm not even going to look at him. I've asked that question, I'll bet, thousands of times to men. If you walked in, Christian men, and found your wife looking at pornography, what would be your thought? And 100% of the time, I don't think I've ever had it said differently, it would be a turn on.
Okay. Well, see, that's just where, I'm.
If you can imagine guys saying that. So I'm not endorsing that and saying this is healthy, but I'm saying, but I think what we're after on this podcast is let's talk about what we call partners or wives whose husbands have been in it, because
but
the
even
logic.
for the guy, Jim, I mean, we're going to go there. Even for the guy, why is it a turn on? There's already a sense of control and imagination that's taking place. It actually is about selfish needs.
Yeah.
It's they get to participate in something that I
Ding
want.
dong.
Now, if we're going to go really deep into it, and it's a dark hole of pornography on the types of pornography, what is your search habits, all of this other stuff, there's going to become an issue even that happens there. Because what if she's into something that you're not? And so this imagination gets disrupted
or
instantly.
someone, like she wants to look at pornography and that guy looks different than him. You get what I mean,
Yep.
right? And that does happen like what? Because we guys compare. So I think we're talking about the PTSD factor to me is the big one, whether you take the D out. Post-traumatic
so what
stress.
I'm saying is when a wife, I don't know if we say catches her husband.
It's either discovery or disclosure. There's
Okay.
not a
And
third
I think
option.
they kind of probably know.
Okay.
I mean, right? They kind of know what's
Smell
happening.
smoke.
Yeah.
Don't know where the fire
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, but
Just naming it.
sometimes they can feel like they know something's off, but not know the specifics
happens
of
a
what
lot.
is off.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So through discovery or disclosure, a wife finds out that her husband is watching porn all the way to addicted to porn or whatever.
Yep.
What's happening to her?
Survey says, number one thing, period. She will feel compared. I can never, if that's what you're watching, she stumbles across it, or many have gone and said, I'm going to go back to the history trail. That's what you're watching. I'm never going to participate in that. That's what she's wearing. That's the act she's doing. I'm never going to participate in that. So she'll feel compared, thinking, I cannot ever be his greatest fantasy. She might see what he's typed in the search engine. That's what he's looking for. It's called an arousal template. That's a whole deeper show. That's what he wants to look at. I can never be that. She's going to feel that. She's going to think, whether she is cognizant of it or not, where else in her life did a boyfriend, her own father, someone else sexually betray her? Did a pastor? We've discovered he was into porn or had an affair, and that's that. Time collapses. She'll revise the history back fast in trauma and say, wow, if it's hysterical, it's historical. I can't prove that in every case. It'll be like saying, and the shattered dream part is, I never thought. my husband would ever do that. As we talked, remember back there when we were having our 2-hour delightful conversation offset, and sometimes women will say, well, I don't know about these other jokers or whatever, but my husband